we have today this wonderful, if at least to me, somewhat potentially ambiguous story about Jesus going to a wedding. Now, the way this is laid out, this is something that happens very early on in Jesus' ministry. It really happens right after he comes back from the desert. Remember, we talked about Jesus being baptized by his cousin John, and then he's driven out into the desert by the Holy Spirit, where he'll have an encounter with Satan. Now, the way the lectionary has this set up, it might be difficult for us to understand because we just heard about John baptizing Jesus, and all of a sudden we're talking about this. But this actually takes place right after Jesus comes back out of the desert. He comes back out of the desert, and there he sees a wedding invitation, and I guess his disciples are invited too, and his mom is invited, and there they all are at this wedding. Now, you may be under the impression that people in our day and age know how to party. For example, I have, on occasion, been fortunate enough to be at the home of Al and Joan Daly, for example, on New Year's Eve, or some other time, and you know, they know how to party. You all probably know how to party, but 2,000 years ago, a Jewish wedding went on, and it went on. Anybody have an idea? It went on for 3 days. 3 days. That would be 3 days of eating. 3 days of dancing. 3 days of telling stories. And dare I say it, 3 days of 3 days of drinking. Well, they did. They just did. 3 days of drinking. He kind of went along with a good time. I guess I should have to just interject here respectfully, as I always enjoy seeing my Baptist brethren negotiate this passage. You know, I just love to hear some of the mental gymnastics. It's just wonderful. I should be so creative. One of my favorites, of course, that a lot of use is, well, you know, in those days the wine wasn't really fermented. They called it wine, but actually it was just grape juice. Kind of like Welch's. I have it on pretty good advisement that just isn't necessarily so. It was wine, and probably pretty strong, and I'm pretty sure that people enjoyed it a lot. So here we have this story, and I guess the party's been going on for a while, and they're out of wine. And I guess there's another thing you need to know maybe about the culture, is they had a culture that was based on two things, essentially. In day-to-day transaction, day-to-day discourse. Shame and honor. Honor and shame. And to invite a whole mess of people, probably the whole town, and run out of wine in the middle of the party, and thereby, have you been at a party where they run out of wine? You haven't? No. Worse yet, have you ever tried to throw a party and suddenly discover you're out of wine? To say the least. This would have been a shame. This would have brought shame on the family, it would have brought shame on the bridegroom, it would have brought shame on the bride, it would have been shame to their parents. So this was a big deal. No wine. Well, it sounds kind of shallow, but party's over. So here's Jesus, and he walks in with his, well, I kind of call it like it is, kind of hippie, philosopher, indigent, homeless friends. And there they are, robes and sandals and long hair, and Mom comes up to Jesus. John doesn't give us a name, by the way. Notice that. There's a reason for that, but we'll call her Mary because everyone else does. Mary, Jesus' mom, comes up to Jesus, And she says, they're out of line. Jesus, well, he almost seems too human here, if you know what I mean. He says, dear woman. I don't know if that's really accurate. It was probably something more like, Ma, do you know what I've been through in the last month? I'm here with my friends. What on earth does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with me, says Jesus to his mother. I guess Mary knows her boy, and she doesn't even respond to that. She just gives him a pass on that. She looks at the servants and says what? Do whatever he says. I have no idea what he's going to say. It's probably going to be weird. He's like that. But do whatever he says. So the servants, well, they're getting paid by the hour. They don't care. All right, wait table, serve one, go get some water. Did you catch those measurements? There were 6 of these jars. They're probably earthenware jars. They're probably made out of clay, maybe they're made out of stone. They're used for ceremonial washing. So they have to have enough water in there for people to bathe in. The people don't bathe in the jars, but they get the water out of the jars to bathe in. 20 or 30 gallons. 20 or 30 gallons. And a gallon of water weighs about how much? It's about 5 pounds, give or take. A gallon of water is about 5 pounds. So these things are enormous, and they are heavy. So chances are the servants did not pick up the water jugs and try to lower them into the well or hold them in the stream. They had to go get the water and fill the jars. Get the water, fill the jars. Imagine that. There are 6 of these things. They're 30 gallons apiece. And Jesus is done going to turn them into wine. That's a lot of wine. Well, we know how this story goes, right? We know how the story goes. They fill the things up. Go show it to the maitre d'. Go show it to the guy who's running the show. He says, well, never mind, I'm sure he says something. He says, wow, this is great stuff. And you'll notice when next happens, he calls the bridegroom aside. The bridegroom guy who's paying for all this. He calls the bridegroom aside and says, what are you doing? I mean, most people, things don't change, right? Most people, they serve the good stuff first. They bring out the top shelf stuff first. Then, when the guests have had enough to drink, or maybe they're just plain drunk, maybe they believe this is probably not Welch's, they bring out the cheap stuff when nobody really cares. You've saved the best for the last. Just remembering all the sermons that I've heard on this story, and all the sermons that I've preached on the story, and all the commentaries, one of the things that's both wonderful and frustrating about the story is that I don't think any two people have the same idea as to what it means. And there are certainly a lot of people who kind of wish this story weren't positioned where it was. After all, John would tell us that this was Jesus' first public miracle, the first of his signs. And for some people, it's kind of embarrassing. I mean, after all, he's turning water into wine, and what really sounds, after all, kind of like it's going to wind up being a great big drunk. Couldn't you have made the first miracle maybe given sight to a blind guy? Couldn't you have healed a leper? I mean, couldn't you have made bread or fish or why wine, Jesus? I mean, way to start a ministry there, dude. And there it is. And it's wonderful, and it's ambiguous, it's confusing. This is not the only possible interpretation. This is not the only possible way it could go, but I just wanted to get you thinking about it just a little bit. Just a few things about this, because I firmly believe that all Scripture is God-breathed and given for our understanding. That's why we have these stories. uses these stories to illuminate us. God gives us these stories so that our lives might be improved, so we might be able to take something away from it and apply it. I believe this is a story primarily of grace. I just want to walk through it with you and maybe show you the elements of grace. So let's backtrack a little bit. Jesus shows up, and I kind of get the idea that the wedding is already going on when Jesus shows up. Maybe it's been going on for a while. We're sort of led to believe that. It seems like the people have been eating, and maybe more importantly, they've been drinking for quite some time. And they've used up all the drinking stuff. And here comes Jesus, and Mom, Mary, says, son, you gotta do something. Well, what does this have to do with me? Maybe today we'd say, like, that's my problem? But if you kept it as a question, what does this have to do with me? Humanly speaking, the answer is nothing. After all, it's the responsibility of the person throwing the feast to figure this stuff out. And if they're out of wine, it's their unhappy responsibility to tell the guests, hey guys, all out, we're done. This has nothing to do with Jesus. And I believe that's what makes it grace. Did you catch what happened? Jesus says the obvious to his mother. This has nothing to do with me, Mom. It really doesn't. And no sooner does he say this than his mom, in confidence, in faith, remember Mary pondering everything in her heart? She tells the servants, in faith, do whatever he says, regardless of what he just said. Mary, the one who carried Jesus for 9 months, the one who nurtured him, fed him, dare I say, put up with him, knows he is going to do something. So she says, guys, do whatever he says. And that, I believe, is the first indication that this is a story of grace. You see, by definition, grace is undeserved. Grace is not something we earn. It's not something we deserve, and it's not something we expect. Why this couple? Why does this couple have the honor of having Jesus there? My guess is that they were not the only lower middle class couple in Cana having a wedding who overextended themselves and now have to deal with the embarrassment of not having enough stuff to drink. And yet there is Jesus. They don't deserve it. We don't know anything about them. They might be a wonderful, lovely couple. They might be terrible people. We have absolutely no idea, and that's intentional, I believe. They're just these people. And God bestows undeserved, unexpected, surprising grace upon them. See, God doesn't have to do anything. God doesn't have to do anything. When we run out, or when we run up against, God could readily look at us and say, sorry, what does that have to do with me? Yeah, you guys are right, the world is a mess. It's polluted, it's corrupt, it's dangerous. And kids, that's not my fault.